and we're going to continue our series on building an architecture platform by talking about how some best practices and techniques for designing custom architecture viewpoints based on fit for purpose, based on stakeholder needs. And so just a little bit about APG. Basically, our mission here is to, align information technology and systems engineering capabilities with business strategy using best practices. And a big part of that is our participation in industry standards organizations like the Object Management Group, where we've continued to contribute to formal modeling standards such as UML, SysML, UPDM, BPM, and many other 3- and 4-letter acronyms. Also very active in the Open Group, participating in the Architecture Forum around TOGAF, Archimate, and IT for IT, and also play in the Eclipse Process Framework project at the Eclipse Foundation, and are partners with a number of tool vendors, including Sparx, Hewlett-Packard, and IBM. So our objectives for today are to review an industry standard that some of you may be familiar with for these things that we call architecture descriptions, particularly calling out some of the semantical concepts that are critical, namely stakeholders, the things they care about, concerns, ways that we look at content in models called viewpoints, and then the actual content itself rendered on a canvas of some sort called a view. And so we'll introduce a specific technique that we've put together based on that standard for, creating a custom definition of architecture viewpoints based on the scenarios that different stakeholders find themselves in. And we've actually codified that in modeling capabilities by creating an architecture description UML profile. And then we'll talk about the techniques themselves for designing a custom metamodel based on delivering custom architecture content. So many of you may be familiar with the content on this diagram. You may not have seen this specific diagram before, but this is the set of activities that you're supposed to be performing in the TOGAF ADM when you're doing phase B, C, and D, i.e. describing the business, data, application, and technology architecture. And this is a view of those activities in a solution that we've created called the APG TOGAF Process Library, or ATPL, that, among other things, in addition to allowing you to tailor TOGAF to end-user specific needs, it also offers some additional viewpoints of the content that we think are informative. And so here we see the 9-step program that's common to those 4 architecture description phases. And the first one is called Selecting Reference Models, Viewpoints, and Tools. And that's a prerequisite to, the lion's share of the activities that go on in these 4 phases, namely developing a description of the current state or baseline architecture, as well as, and possibly additionally, the target architecture. The idea being is that once we've got those 2 different point-in-time descriptions, we're then in a position to do gap analysis and then can continue on with the activities of, using those gaps as a baseline for creating a preliminary roadmap, and then eventually, finalizing the target architecture based on stakeholder review, and then sharing that content in what TOGAF calls the architecture definition document, which is basically a kind of an Uber document that contains all of the architecture description content, various diagrams, catalogs, and matrices, for example, for the current state architecture, the target state architecture, all of the interim transition architectures in between for all of the architecture domains that are within scope of this particular architecture engagement. And so, that's really kind of the end game for phases B, C, and D is to have, again, a set of ways of looking at this architecture content that describe, how we've addressed various stakeholder needs. And so, success with this begins at the very start of the process, as you might guess, in step 1. So step 1, while it's called Select Reference Models, Viewpoints, and Tools, is really, probably could be better described as eliciting the requirements for modeling. And this is based on, something that we found is pretty critical, is that you especially when you throw in using a modeling tool, perhaps for those that haven't used a modeling tool before, can get very excited, enthusiastic, and ambitious about their expectations and outcomes, but often don't step back and take a broader view of, okay, just because I can model stuff doesn't mean I should model everything. And of course, we got to be really careful about that, because certainly enterprise architects are sometimes accused of trying to boil the ocean. And so it's really important before we dive in and doing this modeling that we take a step back and really think about, what are we modeling, and who are we modeling that for, and what are their expectations and outcomes from building those models. Because at the end of the day, if we end up building models that don't address stakeholder concerns, then I think there's a real valid perspective that maybe these aren't useful or relevant models. So TOGAF, of course, has a lot to offer to kind of get you started with this. So here on slide 5, you can see the taxonomy of architecture viewpoints that TOGAF has to offer out of the box as a part of its architecture content framework. And you'll notice there are, a whole host of different types of way of looking at content. TOGAF suggests there's at least 3 different ways: catalogs or lists or tabular reports, matrices, and diagrams. And, again, out of the box, there's, upwards of 50-plus ways of looking at content, across the 4 different architecture domains, which, as you can see, represent the significant part of this viewpoint library. But also there's a couple in the preliminary phase: architecture vision, phase E, opportunities and solutions, and requirements management. And there is a little bit of indication in this picture and the one that we'll see next about, you don't necessarily want to do all of these. The idea with the core viewpoints, the ones that are in a light gray, are those viewpoints that are likely to be possibly useful for many different types of architecture engagements, where the ones that are color-coded are those that are added to the library for a specific kind of use case. So, for example, if we're doing infrastructure consolidation, we may be interested in some of the dark red viewpoints, such as a location catalog or an application migration catalog. If we're doing governance, we may be interested in that contract measure catalog, or if we're process modeling, process flows, and event diagrams. So there's a little bit of indication in the core TOGAF, or the base TOGAF content, about, you shouldn't, create all of these views just because you can. We want to be, again, selective of our choices, so that, again, if we're going to make an investment in doing modeling, we're getting something out of it that people are expecting. But what we find in practice is that, while, again, these are a lot of good ideas to get started, you still really want to take to heed the essence of that first step in phases B, C, and D, which is, who are the stakeholders, what do they need to know, and how am I going to build models that help them understand that? So this, the set of architecture viewpoints then, ties into another thing that you guys have probably seen before, and that's the TOGAF architecture content metamodel. And here we see, the full content metamodel using the same kind of color coding extensions that we saw before. The elements in white are considered to be core content, the kind of stuff that, every organization is almost certainly going to be concerned about for some reason or another. Things like organization units, actors, functions, processes, services, data entities, applications, and technologies. And then additional elements that might be added based on certain use cases, like driver, goal, and objective for doing strategic modeling and motivation modeling. Event control and product for process modeling, location, physical and logical, technology, and application components for infrastructure consolidation. But again, what we find is that, well, this is a great place to start the discussion about, what are the kind of things that we want to keep track of in our architecture repository? We want to elevate the discussion a little bit higher to say, this content metamodel is not just about tooling, although that's going to be a big focus of how we position it today, but it's really, more importantly, the language that we're agreeing to use within the enterprise to describe the enterprise. because there's a lot of subjectivity and diversity in the terms that we can choose to use to do that. You know, so for example, do we call a piece of software that people use to do something, do we call that, well, a piece of software? Do we call it a system? Do we call it a package? Do we call it an application? And of course, the words we choose are, again, very arbitrary, but it's really important as we're trying to work across the enterprise that we have a common set of terms so that we're not confusing ourselves about what we're talking about. So, you know, again, while this provides a good starting point of going, yep, it sure makes a lot of sense that we'd want to keep track of organizations and applications and processes, we think it's really important not to adopt this meta model literally out of the box as it's described here. It's really important for you to take that step back and really think about, you know, why you're building the models that you're building, and then based on those stakeholders, what kind of content you're going to have to capture and how it's going to have to be related to one another. So this really helps, you know, the blank page syndrome provide some basic definitions for some of these things, but we really want to take that step back and make sure we understand what we're doing for the right reasons. So one of the a standard that's been out there for quite some time is currently called ISO IEC 42010-2011, typically called 4210, formerly known as IEEE 1471. And this is a international standard for architecture descriptions, as well as some other good, nice content that was added in the 2011 edition around architecture frameworks and architecture decisions and architecture rationale, although we're not going to focus on those dimensions in this presentation. But the whole idea behind this is that, you know, a system of interest, which could be a technology application landscape, it could be a business landscape, it could be a combination of both, has an architecture. One of the things that perhaps there isn't concurrence about is the way that people think about that architecture and visualize the architecture and talk about the architecture. So, you know, people build models of things in their heads to help them explain the things they see in the universe and the world around them, and very likely without some clear definition of semantics and effective data management, those views are perhaps divergent. So the whole idea is that, you know, a best practice in enterprise architecture is to create an architecture description. As you'd expect, a description of the architecture. This is a human-built set of models and documents that help us call out the most critical aspects of the architecture based on the problems that we're trying to solve, and represents, again, a particular perspective of how we look at the architecture. But again, it's something that humans intentionally build, and there is subjectivity into, you know, what makes an architecture description good and useful. And 4210, you know, I think really tries to get to the heat of that by saying, well, you know, we're not building an architecture description because we can, and we have tools and repositories. It's because we have stakeholders that have concerns, and based on those concerns, and I think of those concerns as being things that keep people up at night, you know, questions that they have about the architecture. And then, you know, based on that concern, we want to provide a certain point of view of looking into a model or a set of models to demonstrate that the information that we've captured does actually address their questions. So we want to think of you know, what are those, you know, who are those stakeholders, you know, what are the requirements, use it as a driver to help us, you know, really custom craft a meta model and a repository that's going to help manage those things. And the slight difference between what you see here on this diagram between an architecture viewpoint and an architecture view is that you want to think of the viewpoint is a way of framing the question or describing the characteristics of how that content's going to be delivered. So in practicality, in many tools, this is in some ways like a report definition template. So for example, if we were talking about you know, finance and accounting, a standard way of looking at information within a general ledger, as opposed to looking at the entirety of the general ledger and every single, double entry transaction. One of them is a profit and loss statement or an income statement, which is a particular way of looking at a subset of the general ledger to understand a certain part of the financial health of an organization, namely the ratio between income and expense. Another way of looking at the same content or a different subset would be a balance sheet that's really trying to look at assets, liabilities, and equity. So the whole idea is that, there are standard ways of looking at accounting content, P&Ls, balance sheets. You could think of those as viewpoints. And then when you, run those reports against the general ledger at a certain point in time, you come out with financial statements, for the first quarter of 2015, and that would be an example of a view. And then you might take the same viewpoints and run them against the same repository, a quarter later. You'll get, the same types of content, but it'll be different content because the repositories change. So again, viewpoints are the templates that define the nature of how the content's displayed and aggregated, and then the view itself is the content itself, the actual diagram, an actual traceability matrix, or an actual report. So what we've done is, we found that the conceptual model of 4210 provided a great foundation. But we wanted to articulate a little bit further, and one of the things that we found is that jumping right from architecture stakeholders to architecture concerns was sometimes tough if we didn't contextualize it with a scenario. So we've, in our technique, we add another element to this approach, the architecture scenario. So given the fact that a architecture stakeholder finds themselves in a certain circumstance, what are the kind of concerns they have when they're in that circumstance? And those things, again, should lead us to the kind of architecture viewpoint that's pertinent, where we want to capture information such as, what kind of modeling language or that we're going to be using, if it's something like Archimate, UML, BPMN, or, a domain-specific language that we've constructed ourselves. Notes about how we're going to display that content to the end user, and if there's potentially alternate ways or multiple alternate ways of showing the same content. And that's related to understanding the model kind that's pertinent to that architecture viewpoint, where we really want to make sure we understand what are the kinds of elements that we need to render this diagram or this report. What are the pieces of data about those elements we possibly need to render? And then what are the expected relationships that we're going to have to traverse in order to show the content? And are there going to be any constraints placed on the relationships and the properties to, filter out certain kinds of things that we're not interested in? And then, we acknowledge the TOGAF definition of there being at least 3 different types of architecture viewpoints, diagrams, catalogs, and matrices, but in practice we see that there are certainly more than that. There's just plain old images, pictures that people draw in Visio or PowerPoint or in a graphics editing program. Sometimes architecture viewpoints are delivered anecdotally through narrative text. But we also may find, higher level, repository-based viewpoints such as dashboards, roadmaps, and graphs. And again, certainly don't mean to suggest that this is an exhaustive list, but at least an obvious set based on what we see in industry practice. And we really want to think about, this refined model of architecture viewpoints really represents, who cares about the architecture, why do they care about the architecture, what do they care about the architecture, and how are we going to show them that we've, again, captured that content to help them understand. And so associated with that, we've come up with a real simple process for really designing a custom meta model that addresses specific stakeholder concerns based on the 4210 conceptual model. And so here we see a BPMN diagram that basically says, we've got, when we're doing this, which again would be in concert with both the preliminary phase in TOGAF when we're both initially establishing our architecture practice and setting up our tools, but also revisiting it as it relates to the first step of phases B, C, and D. So we've got the someone who's responsible for managing the architecture framework, people that are responsible for managing the content in the framework and doing design to evolve the framework. So we got the process starting off by the architecture framework manager identifying the architecture stakeholders, and again that could be at large in general in the preliminary phase or very specifically on a certain kind of architecture project in phase B, for example. Do an interview with that architecture stakeholder and then elicit from them, again, the scenarios that they find themselves in that we feel architecture could provide a good response. Work with them to describe their architecture concerns, and then from that derive a set of viewpoints that we hope are going to address those concerns. But then, before we just go ahead and decide that, we're going to go, build one, we should just maybe check with the librarian real quick. So the idea here is that we want to go retrieve the viewpoint in case it possibly exists. If it does, then we're done with this workflow, no more to do. But if the viewpoint does not exist, then we need to go over to the framework designer who designs the architecture viewpoint, updates the architecture metamodel, and then stores that viewpoint in the viewpoint library for future retrieval. So the rest of the presentation, I'm basically going to go through some examples of how, we've used this in the real world. We've got, in some cases, a pretty simplified, narrow set of scenarios just to keep it on the, pretty straightforward. But, we find that when we do this, again, particularly when establishing an architecture practice or, a non-trivial engagement, there are far more stakeholders and there's far more scenarios and concerns. But, even just with these three different stakeholders, a solution architecture manager, an application owner, a solution architect, and these related scenarios, it's very interesting how complex just the data requirements for capturing that content can be. So, again, an architecture manager may be interested in understanding the impact that projects that are being proposed or that are in flight have on the entirety of the architecture, application architecture landscape. An application owner perhaps takes a more finite view of that and says, well, I get being interested in the big picture, but I really mostly care about the impact of projects on my applications that I own. A solution architect might have a different set of scenarios of, hey, I'm charged with, developing some blueprint for a project, so that's, in order to do that effectively, I'm going to have to know some things about the enterprise architecture landscape. And part of that would be understanding what the current application architecture landscape is and the target architecture application landscape, because again, this is the solution architect at the project level who is, hopefully, being an effective liaison to the solution delivery community on the intent of the target architecture from the enterprise architecture community. So we're going to take a closer look at one of these stakeholders and one of these scenarios, in particular the solution architect and the scenario of developing a project architecture blueprint. So one of the concerns that they have, and those are the rectangles that you see here on the right of this diagram, is, well, which applications are impacted by this project? And what is the anticipated impact of this project on each individual application? In the context of this project, which applications are interacting with other applications? So this is kind of getting to understanding, some application context and interaction. What's the nature of those interactions? Are any of those interactions going to be changed? So this is getting to, do applications, what are the protocols or, the integration techniques are being used, or is it point-to-point? Is it real-time batch? Is it publish, subscribe, asynchronous, synchronous? As everybody knows, there's a whole bunch of different ways to do this, and, these are the kind of things that a solution architect is trying to understand and, again, help other stakeholders understand how that's changing over time. Are there, again, changes that we're going to be making to existing interactions? Are there going to be interactions that we add that didn't exist before, and there are going to be relationships that are going to be removed because of the evolution of the landscape? So now that we've got, the architecture stakeholder, the architecture scenario, which helped us, again, contextualize a finite set of architectural concerns. And, of course, by the way, these architecture concerns, the rectangles in the middle, they may actually be the same concerns of other stakeholders across the enterprise. So there's certainly a possibility of reusing them across this elicitation process. And, based on these, 8 set of concerns, the framework, manager said, well, 2 of the ways that we can address those sets of concerns is with these 2 types of architecture viewpoints. One of them is a project application list. The viewpoint type is a grid, not using any specific modeling language, since it's really a tabular report. Information about the model kind that needs to be contributed in order to make this happen. So we need application data and project data, and specifically the application's name, the application's owner, the impact of the project on this application, and the name of the project. The relationships that we're going to need to do that is one that we're going to call project impacts application. We don't actually want to know all of the projects that impact all the applications. It's just those by a specific project that the solution architect is concerned with at the time. And the notion that there could be an alternate depiction of this from being a tabular catalog and could be shown using an extended UML class diagram that shows relationships between applications and projects. And that takes care of the first 2 concerns of which applications are impacted by the project and what is the actual nature of that impact. And then the remainder of the architecture concerns, figure we can address those with a logical application diagram. And this is going to be, of course, a diagram. We're going to, make the foundation of it a UML component diagram, but we're going to extend that. We're going to need the application element and a number of different attributes, the name of the application, the impact type of the project, the interaction type, and the impact type on the interaction. We're going to, of course, then need to traverse the relationship between applications, as well as, again, constraining that to a specific subset based on a particular project. And some notes about how to display this is that we could emphasize the impact of the project has on each application by changing the border color or width of the application icon on the diagram, and emphasize different types of interaction types with possibly different types of line styles on the diagram. So, now that we've got an idea, again, who cares, why they care, and how we're going to address those concerns, we now have enough information to actually specify the meta model, or, another way to think about the architecture, meta model is it's kind of the data architecture of the enterprise architecture practice. And 4210 has some guidance to help with that. The whole idea that a architecture description, in addition to being, a collection of viewpoints and views to help with interacting with stakeholders, it also includes reference to a number of architecture development or architecture description elements, where those architecture description elements have correspondences, which is the word 4210 uses for relationships, based on a correspondence rule. And so this whole idea of a correspondence rule is a call out in 4210 to the relationships that are allowed based on the architecture meta model. So slide 14 actually is showing the custom meta model based on those 2 viewpoints for the solution architect. So if we went on and elicited the detailed requirements from the application owners and from other stakeholders for their other scenarios, this meta model would be certainly more extensive, but just even based on the one scenario of creating a blueprint, there's some non-trivial content that we're going to have to keep track of. So applications, we're going to be interested in properties like, what's the name of the app, its description, maybe interesting some stuff about compliance, understanding its, target life cycle state, where you can see at the bottom there's an enumeration that talks about what those different states might be: proposed, provisional, standard, contained, retired. And what's the criticality of this application, which is, again, another enumeration: safety critical, mission critical, essential, regular, or non-critical. And then, of course, applications then interact with other applications. That's a reflexive relationship in the upper left-hand corner. But there's an association class associated with that, because we want to know more than just the fact that two applications interact with one another. We want to understand something about the nature of that interaction. So that's what the application interaction association class is for. And it, real simply, we're basically just curious about, is this a batch interaction or a real-time interaction? Then to finish up the application definition, we also want to know who owns the application. In this case, we chose it to be a person. In practicality, we'd also have some, organizational information here as well. And then, of course, there's the project element, which, is the way that the application owner and solution architect are looking at it. So we need at least some minimal information about the project, its name, start date, end date, who the PM is, who the architect is, which happens to be, another instance of a person. But then we also want to understand each project's impact on the application as a whole. So there's a relationship between the two of those with another association class to represent the nature of the project's impact on that application, which is that there isn't an impact. We believe there's an impact, but we need to validate that. We don't think it's a big deal, but we want to make sure the upstream and downstream people aren't surprised. Verify impact is, something a little bit more rigorous, that we're pretty certain that there is an impact, and we're going to have to look into that. And then there's the highest level of certainty, which is absolutely we are changing this thing, so it is being impacted. And then the other impact relationship we're interested in is not just the application as a whole, but the impact the project's going to have on the interactions between applications. So again, are we going to, add a new relationship? Are we going to remove one? Are we going to enhance it? So on and so forth. So, and some of you might know, even though this is, a quote-unquote pretty simple Metamodel, at least compared to the complete Metamodel that TOGAF has to offer, it's a non-trivial job to, A, find this information, populate it in a repository, and keep it current. So imagine doing that not just for applications and projects, but for organizations and processes and services and technologies. Again, this is a non-trivial task, so in this case, we're trying to keep it simple. So to implement this, one of the best practices that we find out there is to, and of course this is very effective for UML-based tools, is to create what's called a UML profile. And a UML profile is a built-in extension mechanism that's found in the Unified Modeling Language for basically creating, domain-specific languages. And, how these work in different tools depends, but, at the end of the day, it's usually something like this. We're going to, see some examples of how you, specify a UML profile in Sparx Enterprise Architect. And in this case, we need to identify, the three types of elements that are in this Metamodel: application, person, and project. And then in Enterprise Architect, you basically need to say what is the meta type that we're applying this to. So we chose that the application stereotype is going to be a specialization of a component in UML, but it's also going to have some attributes, the business criticality, SOX compliance, and lifecycle state. Person, we decided, was best represented as a type of class, and we've got some additional attributes for that as well, and the same thing for project. It turns out, to be quite honest, in a great deal, the choice of which meta element you choose can be very subjective, although it does depend a little bit on how rigorous your modeling tool enforces UML semantics. So, of course, if you end up picking something that's perhaps not right because your tool doesn't let you draw a certain diagram with that type, then of course you'd make a modification and move forward. But the whole idea behind a UML profile is we're actually codifying the custom metamodel, and we're packaging it in some sort of plugin of some sort, and of course that varies from tool to tool, that we either can apply to the model as a whole, which is one of the things you can do with Sparx and other tools, or something that's made a part of the tool user's workspace. But the whole idea is that this is, the kind of the configuration of the repository based on our custom requirements that then gets applied to the tools that we're using so that the users of it can be conformant with our semantics. And then after we've defined the elements, then there's also representing the relationships. So, the notion of applications interacting with applications is done with a specialized type of association. The nature of the impact on an application interaction is a type of association class. The notion of a project impacting an application is going to be a dependency, and the notion that applications are owned by people and projects have PMs and architects are going to be also specialized associations. And so the cool thing about how this works, at least in Sparx Enterprise Architect, is you actually build a model of this using the modeling tool, and then you go through a couple of wizards to package this as a UML profile, and typically would also connect it with what's called an MDG technology, which would allow you to also add specific diagram types and toolboxes and other content. Technically, that's outside the scope of a UML profile, which is why I'm not showing some of those implementation details, but again, is a very typical implementation approach for a lot of tools. So let's just take a quick look at the results of, defining this UML profile, packaging it up with Sparx Enterprise Architect as an MDG technology, and then, actually, referencing some application architecture content and project relationships. So here we've got two different projects, the Event Management Salesforce Integration Project and the Portal Integration Project. And so this particular diagram, as you can see at the top, is the Project Application Impact Diagram. So the relationships between a project and an application that are in red are the ones that we know we are expecting to change because of the scope and the requirements of this project. The ones that are green are ones that we're almost certain are going to likely have required changes from a upstream and downstream, provider and consumer perspective. And the ones that are in blue are the ones that we don't think there's a problem, but because they are connected to these other applications, we really want to make sure those application architects, validate that there is or is not an impact. And then we see a different view on the right-hand side for the impact by the Portal Integration Project. And, so one of the things that this might help an application owner understand is, or at least a different version of this is, what are all the projects that are touching, my application? And one of the cool things about how we can use tools like Enterprise Architect is we can, render this graphically like a diagram here, or we could run a report that would show this in a tabular form, and we'll see some examples of that in a little bit. Here we see the logical application diagram for the Event Management Salesforce Integration Project. So again, we're showing two types of impacts, impacts on the application as a whole, as well as impacts on the interactions between the applications. And then we're also demonstrating the nature of the interactions themselves. Real-time interactions are solid lines, and batched interactions are dashed lines. So here we're saying that in this particular project, Salesforce, CRM, event management, and the attendee databases are apps that are going to be impacted. The relationships to other things that are going to be changed are the relationship between the online learning platform and Salesforce. We're going to be adding some new relationships to the customer portal and between the CRM and event management Salesforce apps. And we're going to be removing the relationship to the attendee database from all other applications, which, as you can see from the tagged value in the attendee database, is that we are going to be retiring that app. So that's one of the expected outcomes of this project, and we're going to be propping up a new application, the Salesforce event management platform. And then a number of other relationships are going to stay the same. For example, the real-time interaction between the online payment system and the online learning platform, or the batch interaction between the online learning platform and the resource portal. And here we, again, one of the things that I think is an expectation out of any modeling tool that I work with or, recommend to our clients is that it really should have built into it the capability of taking any content that's in the repository and rendering it at least in the 3 ways that TOGAF suggests: diagrams, matrices, and catalogs. So here we see the same kind of information that we saw on the 2 diagrams ago, except we're seeing it as a matrix. So we've got the applications as rows, the projects as columns, and then we see the nature of the impact at the intersection of the cells. And again, the cool thing about most of these tools is that not only can we take the graphical content and visualize it as a matrix, but we can actually change the relationships on the matrix, and it will update corresponding diagrams as well. And again, that really gets to the essence of what a view is into a model, because ultimately we want to change the content in the model, and then all the views that we've defined will automatically get updated based on changes in that content, so that we don't have to remember to go to all the different ways of looking at the content to represent that. Here we see another viewpoint, an actual view from the repository that's more of an application portfolio report. And so here we're seeing, a typical kind of tabular report. We see the name of the application, the owner of the application, the criticality of the application, its compliance perspective, and its target lifecycle state. And again, this information came out of the repository, no matter how it's been specified in the tagged values and classes in the underlying model. And here we can see a graphical way of representing the relationships between the applications and the owners themselves. So we can represent those with some custom icons. So we kind of see the standard UML application component on the left, but a custom, person-like icon for the people themselves, and we can consequently view that as a traceability matrix additionally. So those are just, a couple of, simple examples of how we can, deliver custom architecture content in many different ways, diagrams, catalogs, and matrices, based on a custom Metamodel designed to address the concerns of a specific set of stakeholders. And, hopefully we've been able to demonstrate to you guys how we can take the, the conceptual information in 4210, bring that down to something practical and real to help, architects really do good work. And, using some of the capabilities of today's modeling tools to capture those decisions and really, enable the organization and architects throughout the organization to capture useful content. So, a lot of the information, some of the stuff that you saw in the presentation is available online if you're interested to go inspect it directly. So the actual Metamodel of 4210 and the associated UML profile is something you can go take a look at. The actual MDG technology that was built off of that, which is packaged as an XML file, is also available. And then if you want to actually take a closer look at the model that we examined, that's also available for download. And if you don't have a license of Sparx Enterprise Architect handy, all of these things you could open up by downloading the trial version of Enterprise Architect off of Sparx's website. And I'd like to just finish up by saying thanks everybody for your time and attention today, and by To extend our appreciation, we're offering AEA members that attended this event a 25% discount on our web-based TOGAF 9 training. And if you've got any additional questions about this or anything else that we might be able to provide guidance on, don't hesitate to contact us. So, that's basically the end of webinar number 5, Designing Architecture Viewpoints. We certainly appreciate the opportunity that the AEA's provided us to continue to talk about, hopefully, topics that are of interest and practicality. So, you see here a tentative list of upcoming topics around application portfolio management, technology lifecycle management, reuse, and a number of other topics. And by all means, if anyone has any suggestions on things that they would like to hear, please don't hesitate to let us know. So thanks very much, everybody, for your attention and participation. And if anybody has any questions that perhaps have been submitted through chat, or you want to do that now, I'm certainly available to respond to those. So thanks very much, folks.
Great, Chris. Let's just see if anyone has any questions. I wanted to thank you for another great presentation, and I also want to let everyone know that this session is recorded and will be made available on the AEA site, and we'll send out a link to that after we complete today's event. I don't think I see any questions. Let me just look one last time. Nope, it looks like we've got a quiet group today.
All right, well, so that either means it made perfect sense to everybody, or I was babbling about stuff that wasn't all that interesting, or maybe somewhere in between. So by all means, if anyone has any questions about this, don't hesitate to let us know. And thanks again, Birgit, to the AEA for giving us this opportunity.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Thank you all for attending.